If you look at the calendar, specifically the week of March 15th to the 21st, you will find this, well, it's a bizarre historical anomaly.
Yeah, it really is.
It's wild, spanning well over a century. This exact same 7-day stretch holds, like the publication of the very first Black-owned newspaper in America, the birth of the master architect behind the March on Washington,
Right.
the tragic Sharpeville massacre in South Africa,
Yeah.
and Lyndon B. Johnson's landmark voting rights speech. I mean, it feels like a glitch in the Matrix.
It does seem almost mathematically impossible. You know, when you lay all the sources out on a table.
Yeah.
You have events from 1827 sitting right next to events from 1965, all clustered within this singular, really intense week in March.
And that is exactly what our mission is for today's deep dive. We are looking at this massive stack of sources, historical records, financial blueprints, diplomatic cables that all converge on this one week.
Which is a lot to get through.
It's a ton. But we aren't just reading a timeline here. I mean, we aren't here to just memorize dates for a pop quiz. We are here, as always, to sort of reverse engineer the blueprint of historical change.
Because the history of human rights, and specifically the history of the Black freedom struggle, is almost always taught to us as this series of spontaneous miracles.
Yes, exactly.
We're conditioned to believe that, you know, a charismatic leader steps up to a microphone, delivers a breathless, beautiful speech, the clouds part, and suddenly society transforms.
Like it's a movie.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a very romantic but very passive way of viewing history.
It treats liberation like magic. You just stand on the sidewalk, look up at this towering, gleaming skyscraper of a social movement, and assume it just, like, popped into existence.
Oh, Deb.
There it is. Right. You don't see the thousands of tons of rebar or the complex supply chains or the deep subterranean foundation that's actually holding it all up.
And the sources we have today completely shatter that illusion of magic. What they reveal is that liberation is not a spontaneous spark. It is a highly structured, meticulously planned blueprint.
Yeah.
It is an engine that requires media strategy, hard economic capital, grueling logistics, and, you know, high-level global diplomacy.
Okay, let's unpack this because
Yeah.
our sources provide a really brilliant phrase to describe this blueprint. They call it the unbroken chain.
Which is such a great visual.
I am obsessed with that imagery. It's not just a scatterplot of random protests, it's a chain. Each link is forged with a very specific utilitarian purpose, connecting directly to the next.
Absolutely.
And by the end of our time together today, the way you, the learner listening right now, view modern movements, whether it's like a local community fighting for a stop sign or a massive global human rights campaign, it will be completely rewired. You will stop looking at the speeches and you will start looking for the infrastructure.
To find that infrastructure, though, we really have to start at the very beginning of the chain.
Right.
Before a movement can mobilize, before it can strike or boycott or pass legislation, it has to be able to communicate. It needs a voice.
It has to tell its own story.
Exactly. It needs to establish what the sources call narrative sovereignty.
Narrative sovereignty.
Mhm.
And to see what that actually looks like in practice, we are going back to the earliest date on our March calendar, March 16th, 1827.
New York City.
Yep, New York City. The publication of a newspaper called Freedom's Journal.
Which is just a seismic event in media history. I mean, Samuel Cornish and John B. Russwurm launched Freedom's Journal, making it the very first African-American owned and operated newspaper in the United States.
And to really understand the gravity of this, we have to pause and look at the mechanics of the media landscape in 1827.
It's grim.
Yeah, I mean, slavery is still completely entrenched as the economic engine of the American South. But even in the North, in cities like New York, where you have communities of free Black Americans, the media is entirely, completely gatekept by white publishers. The printing presses, the distribution networks, the editorial boards, it is a closed loop.
The gatekeeping was absolute. If a Black person was mentioned in a mainstream newspaper in 1827, it was almost exclusively through a derogatory lens.
Right.
They were subjects of ridicule or, you know, statistics in a crime blotter, or at best, the subjects of abstract philosophical debates among white intellectuals about the quote-unquote question of Black humanity.
Like they were a theoretical concept, not people.
Exactly. The narrative was entirely weaponized against them.
Which makes the founding editorial of Freedom's Journal so incredibly powerful. The sources highlight a specific quote from Cornish and Russwurm in that first issue, and it goes, "We wish to plead our own cause, Too long have others spoken for us.
We wish to plead our own cause. I mean, it is a fundamental declaration of independence.
Yeah.
And the mechanism of what they were doing is what's really important here. They weren't just writing letters to the editor of white newspapers begging for a platform.
Or asking for fairer coverage.
Right. They understood that you cannot dismantle a hostile narrative using the machinery owned by the people who created that narrative in the first place.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because when I was reviewing these documents, my mind immediately jumped to our modern digital landscape.
Oh, totally.
What Cornish and Russwurm did in 1827 is the exact DNA of what we see happening right now with decentralized media.
Yes.
Think about the rise of independent creator-owned platforms. Think about the massive shift away from legacy media conglomerates toward, like, independent podcasts or independent journalists launching their own newsletters to cover their own communities.
It is the exact same underlying impulse. If the mainstream gatekeepers refuse to cover your community with nuance and dignity, you stop asking for permission and you build your own infrastructure.
It is the 19th century equivalent of bypassing the massive tech monopolies to build your own server.
Pretty much.
I mean, they literally acquired a hand-cranked printing press. They had to source their own paper and ink. And this is the part that blows my mind there, is the logistical nightmare of distribution.
Right, because you can't just hit publish and send an email blast.
Exactly. How do you get a physical newspaper into the hands of readers across a deeply hostile country in 1827?
That is the hidden genius of Freedom's Journal. They had to build this covert, parallel distribution network.
Wow.
They relied on a vast network of authorized agents. We're talking ministers, local business owners, traveling abolitionists who would transport these physical papers across state lines.
They were basically smuggling them.
Yes, smuggling these papers onto ships, hiding them in train cargo, moving them through informal word-of-mouth networks.
That's incredible.
They proved that narrative sovereignty isn't just about having the courage to write the truth. It's about having the logistical brilliance to actually deliver that truth to the people who need to read it.
But wait, because I have a question here. Abolitionist literature existed for decades, right? There were anti-slavery pamphlets floating around everywhere.
Sure.
So why does our calendar jump forward just 4 days to March 20th, 1852, and present us with a piece of fiction as the next major link in the chain? We are talking about the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Because Uncle Tom's Cabin represents a completely different mechanism of narrative warfare. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel sold 300,000 copies in its first year alone.
Which is an insane number for 1852.
It was a global phenomenon, and it fundamentally shifted the psychological landscape of the United States.
I have to push back on this, though, or at least point out a massive contradiction in our sources.
Okay, let's hear it.
We literally just established that the entire point of Freedom's Journal was narrative sovereignty, right? Too long have others spoken for us.
Right.
But then we look at the undeniable world-shifting impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, is a white woman. She is an outsider.
Yes, she is.
So if the goal is owning the voice, how do we reconcile the fact that this specific book, written by someone outside the community, became the ultimate catalyst?
That tension is incredibly important, and the sources don't shy away from it.
Yeah.
It requires us to look at how the book was actually constructed.
Right.
Harriet Beecher Stowe held the pen, and, she reaped the fame, but she did not invent the emotional or factual core of that universe.
Okay.
The sources explicitly detail that the novel was built upon the first-hand, lived accounts of formerly enslaved people, most notably a man named Josiah Henson.
Josiah Henson. So his actual life experiences, his trauma, his escape, that was the raw material.
Precisely. The undeniable truth of the system of bondage belonged to Black Americans like Henson. I mean, they were writing autobiographies, they were speaking on the abolitionist circuit.
Right, Frederick Douglass, people like that.
Exactly. But those factual accounts were largely preaching to the choir. They were being read by people who were already abolitionists. The broader, complacent white public in the North was largely ignoring the facts.
They were just tuning it out.
They could abstract the violence. They viewed slavery as this, economic policy debate happening far away in the South.
So why did fiction break through the noise when the actual journalistic facts hadn't?
Because fiction bypasses the intellectual defenses and goes straight for the emotional core.
Oh, that's really profound.
Journalism requires the reader to engage with data and policy, which is easy to dismiss if it doesn't affect you. fiction forces the reader to sit at a dinner table with a family, to watch a mother desperately try to protect her child, to feel the absolute terror of a family being physically ripped apart on an auction block.
So Stowe functioned as an amplifier, like a very specific piece of cultural technology.
That is exactly what she was. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Stowe used her cultural access as a prominent white woman to smuggle the unbearable truths of Josiah Henson into the parlors of complacent white America.
Wow.
Our sources use a very modern term for this, the viral moment.
The 1852 version of breaking the internet.
It really was. It forced the world to look at slavery not as a political debate, but as a deeply immoral, family-destroying system. It polarized the nation and rapidly accelerated the path toward the Civil War and ultimately liberation.
Which really complicates the idea of the unbroken chain, doesn't it? It shows that while you absolutely need the foundational truth tellers, the Cornish and Russ Worms, the Josiah Hensons to document reality, you sometimes need an amplifier.
You do.
You need someone who possesses the precise cultural skeleton key to force the dominant society to finally pay attention to that truth.
And this is where we really need to challenge the listener. Think about your own media consumption today.
Yes, think about this.
When a massive social issue suddenly goes viral, when everyone on your timeline is sharing the exact same infographic or video, who is the amplifier? And more importantly, whose underlying, quiet, lived reality actually fueled that moment?
Are you seeing the Josiah Henson? Or are you just engaging with a Harry Beecher Stowe of this situation?
Right. Understanding the difference between the foundational source code and the megaphone is crucial for media literacy.
I love that framing. But, narrative sovereignty has a hard limit. You can print all the independent newspapers in the world. You can write the most devastating viral novel in human history.
Here.
But if the people reading those words are completely, fundamentally, economically dependent on a hostile system, they cannot afford to take action.
No, they can't.
Outrage is an emotion, but passion alone doesn't sustain a multi-decade movement.
Passion burns out. It needs fuel.
Exactly. You cannot organize a massive boycott if your community relies on the hostile businesses for their daily survival. You cannot fund independent journalism if you don't have independent businesses to buy the advertising space.
It's all connected.
So you have the narrative spark, but now you need an engine. And the sources reveal that the hidden engine of historical liberation runs on hard economics.
Which brings us to the next date on our calendar, March 18th, 1910.
Right.
Indianapolis, Indiana. The massive corporate expansion of Madam C.J. Walker.
Sarah Breedlove, who transformed herself into Madam C.J. Walker, widely recognized as the first self-made female millionaire in America.
That's her.
But let's set the historical stage for 1910, just to be clear on what she was up against. We are decades past the end of the Civil War. We are deep, deep into the suffocating era of Jim Crow.
Yes.
Black Americans are systemically locked out of traditional banking. They are locked out of corporate boardrooms. They face violent economic retaliation if they attempt to assert political power.
It was systemic control.
If a black man in the South registered to vote, his white employer would simply fire him, or the white-owned bank would call in his mortgage.
The economic system was weaponized to enforce political compliance. And amidst all of that, Madam C.J. Walker recognized a fundamental truth. You cannot have political freedom without economic independence.
You literally can't afford it.
Right. So on March 18th, 1910, she moves her operations to Indianapolis and builds an empire, a massive factory, a hair salon, and a laboratory.
But she isn't just manufacturing hair grower and pressing oils, right? Like, if you only look at the surface, you see a beauty cosmetics company.
But if you look at the X-ray, you see a masterclass in building a parallel economy.
Yes.
What's fascinating here is the exact business mechanism she utilized. She didn't just hire wage workers to stand on an assembly line. She created a multi-level direct sales model.
Oh, this is so smart.
She established a national network of thousands of women whom she trained and branded as beauty culturists.
I once stop and look at that mechanism because it's brilliant.
Yeah.
If you manufacture a product in 1910, you normally have to sell it through retail stores, right?
Yeah, naturally.
But the retail pharmacies and department stores were white-owned and often refused to stock products made by black entrepreneurs, or they would severely underpay them.
Yeah.
How does her direct sales model solve that?
By bypassing the hostile retail infrastructure entirely, her beauty culturists took the products directly into the living rooms of black women across the country. She essentially built an invisible, decentralized supply chain right under the nose of Jim Crow America.
She created a closed-loop microeconomy.
Yes. And the political implications of that are staggering.
Yeah.
Because these beauty culturists were not employees, they were independent business owners.
They controlled their own income.
Exactly. Which meant they could not be fired by a white boss for speaking out. They could not be financially ruined by a racist local bank because they were generating their own capital.
This is exactly what I mean about the unbroken chain. Because when you look at Madam C.J. Walker's network, you're looking at an unfireable class of political actors. They had the economic armor required to fund the movement.
They bought the advertisements in the independent black newspapers, keeping the narrative sovereignty alive.
Right.
They funded the legal defense funds for civil rights activists. They paid the bail money for protesters. Madam C.J. Walker didn't just sell beauty products. She engineered a decentralized war chest for the black freedom struggle.
It is the ultimate historical precedent for what we now call side hustle culture, or the gig economy. But today, we often talk about having multiple streams of income so you can, like, buy a nicer car or take a vacation.
Right, very individualistic today.
But Madam C.J. Walker professionalized an entire industry so that her community could literally afford to fund their own liberation.
So you have the narrative spark, and you have this incredible independent economic engine generating capital, but capital sitting in a bank account or circulating within a community doesn't automatically organize a massive political strike.
Right, doesn't.
You need an architect. You need someone who knows exactly how to deploy that capital and that energy for maximum systemic impact.
Which brings us to arguably the most underappreciated genius in American history, March 17th, 1912.
The birth of Bayard Rustin.
In Westchester, Pennsylvania.
Bayard Rustin is the linchpin of the mid-20th century civil rights movement. He is the ultimate operator.
I keep using the term project manager, but even that feels too small. It's almost insulting. When people think about the peak of the civil rights movement, they almost universally point to the 1963 March on Washington for jobs and freedom.
Of course.
And the image burned into our collective memory is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, delivering the "I Have a Dream" speech. It is the oratorical fire, the gleaming glass of the skyscraper.
But Dr. King didn't organize the march. He was the visionary, he was the voice, but he was not the logistician. Our sources highlight Bayard Rustin as the chief organizer. He was the man tasked with the terrifyingly complex reality of bringing 250,000 people to a highly segregated Washington, D.C. on a single day in August 1963.
Let's actually look at the logistics of that because it hurts my brain to even think about it. Imagine trying to coordinate 250,000 people today. You have email, you have Slack, you have GPS, you have cell phones.
It would still be a nightmare today.
Right. But Rustin had rotary phones, index cards, and legal pads. How did he actually do it?
It was a masterpiece of granular planning. I mean, Rustin had to negotiate with heavily segregated transportation companies to charter thousands of buses and dozens of special trains.
Just getting them there is a monumental task.
And then he had to map out exactly where those buses would park so they didn't completely paralyze the capital's grid.
And what about basic human needs? You have 250,000 people standing outside in the swampy heat of a D.C. summer.
He had to secure massive quantities of portable toilets. He had to set up first aid stations every few hundred yards. And then, like you said, there's the food. You have to feed these people.
Oh man, the food logistics.
Rustin organized an astonishing operation to produce roughly 80,000 boxed lunches.
80,000.
Yes. He coordinated with volunteer networks, mostly women in church basements across the region, to assemble these meals. And he had to account for the August heat, ensuring the ingredients wouldn't spoil.
Oh, because a mass food poisoning event would have been disastrous.
Exactly. Imagine a mass food poisoning event during the greatest civil rights demonstration in history. The media would have had a field day.
It's mind-blowing. And he also had to handle security, right? Because they knew the local D.C. police and the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover were deeply hostile to the movement.
Yes. Rustin could not rely on the state to protect the marchers from counter-protesters or instigators. So he essentially trained and deployed his own internal security force, hundreds of marshals, mostly off-duty black police officers and union members who were rigorously trained in nonviolent crowd control.
Wow.
He engineered a temporary, perfectly functioning, self-sustaining city for one day.
So why isn't his name as famous as Dr. King's? Why is the architect hidden in the shadows while the speaker gets the statue?
This raises a really important question about identity and the politics of respectability within social movements. Bayard Rustin's identity made him a massive liability in the eyes of many movement leaders, and certainly in the eyes of the media.
How so?
First, he was a Quaker, deeply rooted in radical pacifism. In fact, he was the man who spent weeks with the young Martin Luther King Jr. during the Montgomery bus boycott, rigorously teaching King the tactical, mechanical application of Gandhian nonviolence.
Wait, really? Rustin taught King?
Yes, King had the theological framework. Rustin provided the operational manual.
That's incredible. But his religious pacifism wasn't the main issue, was it?
No. The primary reason Rustin was forced into the background is that he was an openly gay man in the mid-20th century.
Right. The homophobia in America at that time was absolute. It was weaponized by the state.
Exactly. The FBI and hostile politicians constantly threatened to expose his sexuality to discredit the entire civil rights movement. But sadly, he also faced intense homophobia from within the movement itself.
That's so tragic.
Many prominent civil rights leaders viewed him as too controversial to be a public-facing figure. He was repeatedly sidelined, hidden away in back rooms to do the grueling operational work without receiving the public credit.
But the sources point out something incredible here. The very identity that forced him to the margins is exactly what gave him his superpower.
Oh, absolutely.
His lived experience as a gay man, as a black man, as a Quaker, and as someone deeply involved in labor rights gave him this unparalleled ability to see the interconnectedness of systems.
He utilized an intersectional approach to organizing decades before the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw.
Right.
Rustin understood that the struggle of a white unionized coal miner in Appalachia facing corporate exploitation and the struggle of a black sharecropper in Alabama facing violent voter suppression were fundamentally linked by the same oppressive economic and political machinery.
That's why it wasn't just a march against racism. It was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom.
Exactly.
That dual demand, bridging labor and civil rights, was Rustin's architectural design.
He built a coalition that brought together disparate groups, labor unions, student activists, religious leaders who often deeply distrusted each other. He was the glue.
Think about your own life for a second listening to this. Think about your workplace, your community board, your kids' PTA. How often is the logistics person, the one building the spreadsheets, managing the vendors, making sure the audio-visual equipment actually works? How often are they completely overlooked and unthanked?
All the time.
The charismatic person who stands up and delivers the pitch gets the promotion. But the historical sources demand that we respect the mechanics. Without Bayard Rustin's spreadsheets, Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream has no stage.
That's so true.
Without Madam C.J. Walker's capital, the chartered buses never leave the station. Infrastructure is impact.
And when you take that level of flawless logistical perfection, backed by independent capital and fueled by a viral narrative, and you aim it directly at the federal government, the pressure becomes insurmountable.
The unbroken chain achieves critical mass. It forces a collision with the state.
Which brings us to March 15th, 1965, a defining moment in American legislative history. We are looking at President Lyndon B. Johnson delivering a speech to a televised primetime joint session of Congress.
The speech is formally known as the American Promise.
Yes.
To understand why LBJ is standing at that podium on March 15th, we have to look at what happened just 8 days prior, March 7th, 1965, a day forever scarred into history as Bloody Sunday.
In Selma, Alabama, peaceful voting rights activists, including a very young John Lewis, attempted to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Right.
They were met by a phalanx of state troopers and local deputized posses who unleashed a horrifying wave of violence. They beat the marchers with nightsticks, fired tear gas, and trampled them with horses.
And crucially, the television cameras were rolling. The footage was flown to New York and broadcast across the nation, interrupting a highly rated movie premiere.
It was a massive, visceral, viral moment.
It's the 1965 television equivalent of what Uncle Tom's Cabin did in print a century earlier. The complacency of the white public was shattered by undeniable visual evidence of the brutality of the state.
The political crisis for the Johnson administration was absolute. LBJ wanted his legacy to be the Great Society, sweeping domestic programs addressing poverty and education.
He didn't want to deal with this.
No, the civil rights movement in Selma was, from his perspective, a massive, poorly timed distraction. He had been urging Dr. King to wait, to be patient, to stop forcing the issue.
But the unbroken chain doesn't wait.
It does not.
The logistical pressure organized by the activists on the ground, combined with the narrative pressure of the television broadcast, totally cornered the president. So on March 15th, LBJ, a man born in Texas, a master of the Southern political machine, stands before the entire nation.
And he demands that Congress pass a comprehensive voting rights bill.
Right.
But it's how he ends the speech that our sources really focus on.
Yes, this is the key.
He looks directly into the cameras, and he adopts the central anthem of the movement. He says, "It is not just Negroes, but really it is all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome."
We shall overcome.
Yeah.
The President of the United States using the words of the grassroots activists.
It's a huge moment.
It is generally taught as this beautiful, triumphant moment of moral awakening. Yeah. But I want to really push on this. So what does this all mean? When the literal head of the state machinery, the same government whose FBI was actively wiretapping and blackmailing civil rights leaders, by the way, and that head of state stands up and co-ops the movement's branding, how should we view that? Did LBJ see the light and experience a moral epiphany? Or did grassroots pressure literally force the hand of the state?
That is the essential tension of all legislative advocacy. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the state rarely, if ever, concedes power out of pure benevolence.
Right.
The state concedes power when the cost of maintaining the status quo becomes higher than the cost of granting the concession.
It's an equation. It's just math.
Exactly.
Yep.
LBJ was a ruthless, brilliant political calculator. He realized that the movement had successfully paralyzed the country. The domestic outrage and the international humiliation were destroying his political capital.
So he had to pivot.
The state was forced to adopt the moral language of the movement because the movement had outmaneuvered the state.
So it isn't just about persuading the government to be nice. It's about leveraging infrastructure to eliminate their other options.
It proves that the unbroken chain works. The grassroots build the engine, and that engine ultimately pulls the government forward, dragging it into the future, whether the government enthusiastically wants to go or not.
But you mentioned international humiliation just now, which is a perfect pivot. Because the incredible thing about this specific week in March is that it reveals how this struggle wasn't just contained within the borders of the United States.
No, not at all.
The chain spans oceans.
Which brings us to the most chilling, profound, historical parallel in all of our sources. March 21st, we have two massive paradigm-shifting events landing on the exact same day, exactly 5 years apart.
March 21st, 1960, and March 21st, 1965. Let's look at 1960 first. We leave the United States and go to South Africa, the Sharpeville massacre.
On this day in 1960, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, organized a massive, coordinated protest against the apartheid regime's pass laws.
We need to explain what those pass laws actually were mechanically, because they are the ultimate tool of systemic surveillance and control.
Under apartheid, every black South African was legally required to carry a passbook at all times. It was an internal passport that dictated exactly where they were allowed to live, where they were allowed to work, and what areas of their own country they were forbidden to enter.
It's like living in an open-air prison.
Exactly. If you were stopped by the police without your passbook, or if you were found in a white area without the proper stamp, you were immediately arrested, jailed, and often subjected to brutal forced labor.
It was a mechanism designed to guarantee a constant supply of cheap, exploitable black labor, while completely denying black South Africans any freedom of movement.
So on March 21st, the PAC organized thousands of black South Africans to intentionally leave their passbooks at home, march to the local police station in the township of Sharpeville, and offer themselves up for arrest.
Just massive civil disobedience.
It was designed to overwhelm the jail system and paralyze the economy.
A tactic of logistical overload. But the state responded with horrific violence.
The police opened fire on the unarmed crowd. They killed 69 people and injured over 180 others. And the most damning detail, confirmed by medical reports, was that the vast majority of the victims were shot in the back as they were desperately trying to flee.
It is a devastating tragedy. But the sources note a profound echo exactly 5 years later, March 21st, 1965, back in the United States.
Yeah.
Dr. King, working with the SCLC, its organization of established older ministers alongside SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the younger, more radical activists who had initiated so much of the groundwork in Alabama, they finally step off to begin the successful, federally protected march from Selma to Montgomery.
The juxtaposition of these two events on March 21st is not just a coincidence. It is the absolute peak of the unbroken chain concept. What we are witnessing is a dual-continent, synchronized pulse of global Black resistance against systemic exclusion.
We are so often taught to view the American Civil Rights Movement in a vacuum, like a distinctly American story, a domestic dispute. But these movements were deeply intertwined.
The activists in the U.S. were acutely aware of the struggle in South Africa, and vice versa. They shared tactics, they shared philosophies of nonviolent resistance, and they shared the same fundamental goal of dismantling racial caste systems.
And look at the outcomes.
Right. The Sharpeville massacre in 1960 was a massive turning point. The photographic evidence of the brutality horrified the international community. It triggered a massive flight of foreign capital from South Africa and began the long, decades-long process of international economic sanctions that eventually broke the back of apartheid.
The exact same mechanism as Selma. The violence of the state, broadcast to the world, creates a crisis that forces systemic change. Selma secured the Voting Rights Act. Sharpeville catalyzed the global anti-apartheid movement.
It demonstrates that the unbroken chain isn't just a local infrastructure, it is a global network of resistance.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most unexpected link in our historical chain. If we are talking about the global stage, we had to talk about March 19th, 1950.
We are looking at the nomination of Ralph Bunche for the Nobel Peace Prize. He would go on to win it later that year, becoming the very first person of color to be honored in the history of the Nobel Prize.
And this is where the sources really throw a wrench into our assumptions. When you hear Nobel Peace Prize and Black American figure in the 1950s, your brain naturally assumes he won it for his work in the domestic civil rights struggle.
Right.
You assume he was marching or integrating schools or organizing boycotts, but that isn't the case at all.
No. Ralph Bunche was not recognized for his work in Alabama or Mississippi. He was an American diplomat, and he was recognized for his monumental work as a United Nations mediator.
Okay.
Specifically, he was the chief architect of the 1949 armistice agreements between the newly formed State of Israel and 4 Arab nations: Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the sheer magnitude of that achievement, given the context of the era, is staggering.
It really is.
In 1949, the United States is viciously segregated. Military had only just begun to desegregate. Black Americans are fighting just to be treated as human beings, fighting for the right to drink from a public water fountain without being murdered.
The hypocrisy is glaring.
And in the very midst of that oppressive domestic reality, a Black American man travels to the island of Rhodes and successfully mediates one of the most volatile, complex, and high-stakes geopolitical conflicts in the modern world.
He spent months in grueling, localized negotiations. He had to navigate ancient religious tensions, competing national interests, the trauma of the post-WWWII landscape, and the hovering influence of global superpowers.
And he actually pulled it off.
He did. He succeeded. He forged a fragile but real peace agreement.
Why is this included in the unbroken chain of the Black freedom struggle, though? He wasn't working on civil rights.
Because his achievement on the global stage completely dismantled the foundational lie of white supremacy.
Expand on that. How does a Middle Eastern armistice dismantle American segregation?
Because the entire intellectual justification for segregation, Jim Crow, and systemic exclusion was the racist myth of Black intellectual inferiority.
Right.
The system argued that Black people were incapable of complex reasoning, incapable of governance, and therefore needed to be managed and marginalized. Ralph Bunche took that myth, walked onto the most impossibly complex diplomatic stage on Earth, and proved it entirely absurd in front of the entire global community.
Wow.
He demonstrated that the African diaspora possessed the profound intellectual genius required to govern global affairs.
He fundamentally rewrites the narrative. He's saying, we are not just fighting for the basic right to exist in your society. We have the capacity to manage the affairs of the entire planet.
What's fascinating here is how his lived experience actually prepared him for this role. His legacy is the ultimate rebuttal to the idea that marginalized groups only possess expertise in their own marginalization.
That's a great way to put it.
Bunche proved that the skills forged in the crucible of navigating American systemic oppression, the hyper-awareness of power dynamics, the ability to read complex, hostile human motivations, the absolute necessity of strategic, endless patience, those are the exact mechanics that make for a world-class international diplomat.
The skills required to survive. are the exact skills required to lead.
Exactly.
He laid the foundation for every black diplomat, every international policy expert, every ambassador navigating global conflicts today. He proved that the chain of liberation ends with global leadership.
It is the ultimate elevation of the narrative that Cornish and Rusworms started in 1827. We wish to plead our own cause. Bunche proved they could plead the cause of the entire world.
Wow. We have excavated an immense amount of history today. Let's take a breath and look back at the X-ray, the complete blueprint we've uncovered over this singular week in March.
It's quite a journey.
We started by looking at the vital spark of narrative sovereignty. Samuel Cornish and John B. Rusworm building their own logistical distribution network for Freedom's Journal in 1827. We saw how Harriet Beecher Stowe utilized the raw, painful truths of Josiah Henson to create a viral psychological mechanism with Uncle Tom's Cabin, amplifying the message to bypass the intellectual defenses of a complacent public.
We then explored the hidden economic engine required to turn that narrative spark into sustained political power. We saw Madam C.J. Walker in 1910 building a multi-level direct sales empire that bypassed hostile Jim Crow retail, creating an unfireable class of independent business owners who could fund the movement. We saw Bayard Rustin, the ultimate operational architect, using his interceptional identity and unparalleled logistical brilliance to coordinate the terrifyingly complex reality of the March on Washington, the buses, the security, the 80,000 sandwiches.
And we saw how that combination of narrative fire, economic capital, and flawless logistics ultimately forces the hand of the state and spills onto the global stage. LBJ, a Southern political master, co-opting the words "we shall overcome" because the logistical and moral pressure of Selma left him with zero political alternatives.
Exactly.
We witnessed the chilling, synchronized pulse of global resistance on March 21st, with the logistical protest against the passed laws in Sharpeville echoing alongside the triumph of the SCLC and SNCC in Selma. And finally, we saw Ralph Bunche breaking every racist assumption by taking the helm of global diplomacy to mediate peace in the Middle East.
It truly is an unbroken chain. Every single link relies on the specific mechanical strength of the others.
Right.
The journalist needs the entrepreneur to buy the ads. The visionary orator needs the logistician to build the stage and route the buses. The domestic marcher needs the global diplomat to prove their ultimate capacity.
And that brings us back to you, the learner, listening to this deep dive right now. We promised at the beginning that you would look at historical change differently, that you would see the blueprint. Historical change is never an accident. It is never magic. It is a highly coordinated feat of logistics, storytelling, diplomacy, and hard economics.
It's work.
When you see a massive shift in human rights or social policy today, I implore you, don't just look at the gleaming glass of the skyscraper. Don't just watch the charismatic leader giving the viral speech on your feed. Look for the rebar. Look for the people in the background, making the sandwiches, writing the code, funding the independent servers, building the spreadsheets, and quietly negotiating behind closed doors.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to consider long after this audio stops playing. We've spent the last hour exploring how journalists, beauticians, quiet logisticians, and diplomats formed this unbroken chain of historical resistance. Looking at the world today, what seemingly ordinary, everyday profession do you think is quietly building the logistical or economic infrastructure for the next major leap in human rights?
Ooh, that's a good question.
The next Madam C.J. Walker or Bayard Rustin might be doing a job we completely take for granted right now.
I absolutely love that. What an incredible lens to view the world through. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Go out there and look for the blueprint. We will catch you next time.